Conversations podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations Interpreting and Translating podcast. This is our first episode of season 2, so we hope that you have had a wonderful break and you are well rested. But before you know it, we're already in March, so maybe whatever rest you got seems like a distant memory already. Look, today I am very lucky to have Professor Ineke Kreze with me, and we're going to be talking about healthcare interpreting. Tell you a little bit about Ineke. Now, Ineke has been involved in teaching and interpreting since 1991. She's written several textbooks in the area. She's won multiple awards for teaching, including the Vice Chancellor's Teaching Awards, both in 2001 and again in 2012, and won the Student Union Award in 2011. Now, just last year, Professor Ineke became the first professor of translating and interpreting in New Zealand, and she also was made an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for her services to interpreting and translating education. Look, I can keep going on. She's also the co-editor of 2 international interpreting and translating related journals. One's in the USA, Conference of Interpreter Trainers. One's in Australia, Translation and Interpreting with University of Western Sydney. And she's also a practicing interpreter and a translator. Just in the Australian Open, I think she was interpreting for some of the even players there. And she is also the author of the book Introduction to Healthcare for Interpreters and Translators, which was published in 2013. And since then, it's been adapted into quite a few other languages as well. Ineke, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Fatih. And don't forget to mention the fact that that we're working on a special adaptation of the book for Turkish-speaking translators and interpreters, and also one for Russian-speaking translators and interpreters.
Indeed. So we'll come to those adaptations. I've got some questions specifically about the adaptations, and we'll touch on those coming up. So I know that you have a nursing background. So what made you change from becoming a nurse to becoming an interpreter, translator, then to becoming an academic in the field? How did you transition from one to the other?
I actually started, I wanted to do nursing after attending a school with a very strange name of Gymnasium, which is actually a school emphasizing classical education with Latin and Greek and lots of languages. At least those are the subjects I chose to take. But my mum said to me, no, you're not going to do nursing. You're way too clever. What else would you like to do? I said, I would like to be an interpreter. But there was no interpreter courses in the Netherlands at that time. You had to go to Brussels or to Switzerland. And my parents didn't have a lot of money. So as luck would have it, there was the University of Amsterdam and its course in literary translation at the Institute for Translation Studies. So that's where I went. So I really learned to be a translator there. We got both translation theory and translation practice. And after that, I did English language and literature, which was an eye-opener because I realized just how many references to the literature there are in written English. And then in the 3rd year of that, I was doing really, really well. I went to see the student advisor and I said, look, I'm sorry to have to tell you, but next year I want to do nursing. And she said, oh my goodness, we were going to make you an assistant lecturer. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I'm sick of this ivory tower. And so I approached a big training hospital in the Netherlands. And soon, I think no sooner had I had my degree given to me, I think 3 or 4 days later, I was taking part in what we call the preclinical period, where you had 3 months of introduction to anatomy, physiology, all that sort of stuff, before we set foot on our first ward as trainee nurses. Best thing I've ever done. People look at me strangely, but it's just unbelievable what I learned. And nurses were very, very collegial. and really took us under their wing. And it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's taught me a couple of things, actually, both those training courses, translation and nursing, because both of them had a sort of like a situated learning approach, really, mostly the nursing one, but also the translation one, because we actually translated books first together and then individually during our training, which was, there's nothing like doing the real thing and learning from your mistakes, really, before you hand it into the publisher, of course. And then in the hospital, I mean, that's also situated learning. You're actually in the situation. And this is something that I felt was so valuable that I keep trying to bring that into the classroom. So I bring authentic translation texts into the classroom, and I try and introduce the world of the hospital into the classroom by all sorts of different ways, because I feel that just is what brings it to life and prepares people for the reality of practice later on. Does that answer your question? Because I think I've gone down a whole heap of side roads.
No, it definitely answers my question and goes beyond. You spending so much time in the health realm as a healthcare professional, and then bringing that into the classroom when you are teaching, interpreting, and translating in the health care setting. I hear that your classes are full of laughter. And, tell me what happens there.
Well, the first time I was nominated for a Vice Chancellor's Teaching Award, it was by one of my colleagues, and it was in an office next door to my classroom. And he said, "I'm going to nominate you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I keep hearing laughter coming from your classroom." And I said, "Really?" I was really quite astounded. And so the next time I was teaching, I said something funny, and I did some pantomime, and I did some cartoons on the board, and everybody laughed. And then I thought, oh, okay. So that's why people are laughing. I think it's the unexpected sometimes. One day, I think I had a Japanese girl in my class, Aki, a lovely girl. And I said to the students something like, well, I know it's really hard to be a student. It's way harder. Being a student is way harder than being a lecturer. I mean, we've got it easy. I can just stand there and talk. You're going to have to sit there for a couple of hours and try and stay with the game and take it all in. And she said, I said, "What's wrong, Aki? Is something, are you all right?" And she said, "People in Japan would never say that. Our professors would always say that we had it easy and they were the ones that had it so hard." She said, "I have never had a professor like you." And I wasn't a professor at that time. This is quite a long time ago. So, yeah, I learned from all these experiences, because my classes are mixed language, so they're not language specific. So I don't have a whole class of people that are doing Spanish to English or Chinese to English. There's even sign language interpreting students. So we always have New Zealand Sign Language interpreting students and different spoken language interpreting students. And most years, luckily it looks like it's not going to be that way this year, but most years we have up to 17 different languages in the classroom, and people of all ages. And people share. We always start with an icebreaker, and then people share their own views and what's normal in their culture and what they have learned from their life experiences. So it's actually a matter of us learning from each other. It is interactive. I may do most of the talking,
very good.
But I learn a lot. So I have to say that I now feel sorry for the people I taught back in 1991, because I think I've actually improved a lot. But luckily, they and I didn't know that then, so they were happy enough, I think.
So in 1991, was this in New Zealand, or was this?
That was in New Zealand. Yeah, there'd been a cervical cancer research program that had been running for years and years and years under a professor, and it only became known towards the end of the 1980s. In 1987, two journalists published an article about the unfortunate experiment, because it turned out that this professor wasn't telling half of the women that he was treating, he was for cervical cancer, he wasn't telling them, actually, I'm not going to treat you, I'm just going to follow you. So I'll see you in 3 months, see you in 3 months, see you in 3 months. There was no informed consent, there was no interpreters used. There was a government inquiry under a female judge, Sylvia Cartwright, And that found that, yes, that had been happening, and that informed consent had not been used, interpreters had not been used. And out of that came recommendations, and they were enshrined in law in 1996 in the New Zealand Health and Disability Commissioner Act, that under Right 5, the right to effective communication, we have the right to a competent interpreter where practicable. And just running ahead, based on the provisional recommendations of the Cartwright inquiry, the committee that lady led, a lady called Sabina Fenton set up the very first health interpreter class in New Zealand in 1990, and she asked me to be a student in that class. And so I wasn't actually that keen. I thought, well, what can you teach me? I've got a Master of Translation Studies, and I'm a registered nurse, and you're not. I thought to myself. And so I actually did say that, and she said, yeah, but translation is not interpreting, and that's true. And she taught us about note-taking, assertiveness, explaining your role, code of ethics, memory training. That was the first part of the course, and that was really interesting. And then the second part was about health interpreting, and I told her, because I'm Dutch, so I was very direct. I said that is it's no good the way you've done that. I'm sorry.
That's not how you do it.
I'm sorry. And she said, oh, well, you can teach it next year. I said, thank you, I will. So I taught that part next year, and I have to say, I think I improved it a lot.
And you're saying you've even improved yourself in the
yes, because we need to reflect on what we do, not just as interpreters, but also as interpreter educators, and constantly think, wow, how did that go? What could I have done better? What went well? What didn't go so well? How can I improve? And also constantly listen out. Like a friend of mine, Alejo, he works for FIFA. He looks after the fitness of soccer referees. And he said to me, well, we were talking about soccer, and he said he'd done an interesting experiment where the referees were standing way away from the goal line, and they were making decisions about whether a ball had been offside, or whether a player had been offside or not, like sort of like on a diagonal angle. And he said that they started putting a camera so that the referees made the decision, and then the camera showed them whether that decision was right or wrong. And so they got immediate feedback.
Yeah, VAR.
Long before this became the norm, they got immediate feedback on their decisions. And so even though they were still on a diagonal angle and not in line with the ball, that immediate feedback improved their decision making a lot. And I thought, wow, that's what we need for students. They need immediate feedback on their performance. And I started introducing that in my courses, sort of a way for them to get immediate feedback, not ages after, but immediately after they'd done their practice. So yeah, you can learn from everyone all the time.
Let me bring you back to teaching healthcare interpreting, and in regard to the content of the course that you teach. I mean, what do you teach? Do you teach anatomy? Is it terminology? What's involved with healthcare interpreting training?
Well, I have to preface my answer by saying that before students take the class, or at the same time as taking the class, they have to attend a very, very good course called Interpreter Role Ethics and Practice. So where they learn demand control scheme and learn about the New Zealand Society of Translators and Interpreters Code of Ethics, and the one of the Sign Language Interpreters Association of New Zealand Code of Ethics. So we take care of that part, that very important part of being an interpreter there, and then come back so we can revisit it in the health interpreter course. But then terminology, I know a lot of people around the world teach healthcare terminology. And of course, I've got the advantage that I can go further than that. And I think that students need more than terminology. You can teach me legal terminology, and I still won't be much the wiser, to be honest, because I don't understand the legal system and how it works and how a trial works with an interpreter. So my standpoint has always been, right from 1990, when I criticized the course that I was on, my standpoint has always been, no, this is not what we need to learn. We actually need Nursing 101. We need anatomy, physiology, pathology. I don't call it that because I keep things very simple, because I'm already teaching students how the body works, how it's put together, that's anatomy, how it works, that's physiology, and what can go wrong, that's pathology, and then focusing on the most common problems. So if the death rate in a country is strokes and heart attacks, then certainly under cardiology, I will go into heart attacks and the link between them and heart failure, and also with irregular heartbeat, because they can often follow on from a heart attack, not always, sometimes they actually precede or have a different cause. But anyway, so under neurology, I will definitely talk about strokes and tell students that they are very, very likely to be interpreting for a stroke patient, and either for the doctor or for the physio, for the occupational therapist, for the speech therapist. And so, yeah, my standpoint is I need to teach people how the body works, and then together with that, I explain the Latin and Greek. So I tell them in the first class, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to teach you 2 new languages. And they go, don't worry, I'll spoon feed you. Okay. And I said, there's a lot you already know. That's what I always say. Like, you know what a telescope is. So tele means far, scope means look. So it means looking far. Microscope, micro means very small, and scope means look. So anything that has scopy in it means it's a procedure where people are looking at something. And then I asked them, do you know what a bronchoscopy is? And they usually, some of them do. And then I start, taking it into other parts of the body. And I always talk about hysterectomy. Ek is out and tomi is cut. And then I say that people used to think that women were the only ones capable of being hysterical, and that hyster is actually the Greek word for uterus. So well, I think it's all these little things that help people remember. So I give them quite a lot of memory aids, I suppose. And I do Kahoot quizzes at the beginning of the class. And if we are in class, which we're not at the moment because we're in a lockdown situation at the moment, but if we are in class, I start out with a chocolate fish. And then once we've done diabetes, the students don't want chocolate fish anymore. They want protein bars. So then I have to buy protein bars. But anyway, that's a really helpful way of encouraging people to revise what they've learned and to try and do well in the quiz.
I mean, you're so right, though, to actually be an interpreter in a field, not just healthcare, but in any field, we really need to understand, I guess, how the systems work in healthcare, or how the body systems work. And then we marry that with terminology, because terminology itself isn't really going to make sense, or it's not going to actually stay in our long-term memory. And how can you interpret something that you don't have an understanding of? So
that's exactly right. Yeah,
I think it's very important that even if you don't know the terminology there, if you know how something works, you'll be able to paraphrase or unpack. If by chance that something comes up that you don't actually know the equivalence of, but you know what it is. That way you can paraphrase.
Yeah. Well, and especially for sign language interpreters or interpreters for languages that either haven't got the lexicon, haven't got the vocabulary, or people have been refugees, and they may not have had instruction at school in that language. So that's why I always refer to this interview with that my colleague Joanna Byrne did with Hoinang Wongsoon. She's a Samoan, Hoinang is a Samoan interpreter, and she was interviewed and asked, so she said there's very few medical terms in Samoan. And Joanna said, so how would you say malignant pleural effusion? And Hoinang didn't skip a beat. She said, well, I would say to the patient, there is fluid in your chest where your lungs are because of the seriousness of your lung cancer. And that's what it is.
Had she not known how that worked, the anatomy,
she couldn't have done that.
She couldn't have unpacked it.
No, and she does it in very simple, informal Samoan. So it's really clear.
Now, within regards to getting access to this kind of education, I mean, obviously you're in New Zealand. We don't have the luxury of coming there these days, especially, and sitting in your classroom and learning from you. All right. How do interpreters here or anywhere else around the world access this information? Now, you've written a book about this called Introduction to Healthcare Interpreting and Translating.
Yeah, that's right.
What made you write this book?
Well, I never wanted to write that book in the first place. So in 1995, I was teaching a class for South Auckland Health, which is a district health board here in Auckland. And they have a big hospital called Middlemore Hospital. It's a fantastic hospital. And the leader of the interpreting service at the time, Ria Wikaira, he'd asked me if I was willing to teach a health interpreting course there. So I did. And I was a student from Vietnam. And after a few classes, she said to me, Inika, what sort of book can you recommend? And so I recommended a book. And she went to the bookshop and looked at it, and she came back and she said, no, that's not what we want. And so I recommended a different book, and she came back the next week and she said, no, that's not what we want. And I said, at that point, I said, well, what do you want? And she said, oh, it's very simple. She said, when the phone rings and they ring me for a job, they will say cardiology at 9 o'clock or endocrinology 4 o'clock, but I have no idea. How can I prepare myself? So what I would like is a book that has chapters called cardiology, endocrinology, etc. And then in every chapter, just a little revision of, how the heart works, for instance, what can go wrong with it and the main terms, and then all the most common conditions in alphabetical order with the questions the doctor asks, and the treatment and the procedures and diagnostic studies that the doctors will do and the treatments that he will recommend. That would be really helpful. And I thought, oh, shoot, that doesn't exist. And then 20 seconds later, I thought, I'm going to have to write that myself. And at the time, I was working for something called the Suncross Healthcare Line, where people would ring up and say, the doctors just told me I've got bloody blah, blah, blah. And what does that actually mean? And so we had access to computers and to PubMed and all sorts of databases, which were very helpful. And so I would explain, my colleagues and I would explain to people over the phone. And I did that during the day. I had two tiny toddlers, boys. Boys are quite energetic. And by 8 o'clock every night, I would have been able to get them into bed and read them 5 stories, and I would go and work on this book. And I did that every night from 8 to 11 at night before starting the next day, starting my job, etc. And I did that just Monday to Friday. So yeah, very regimented, if you like, almost like military. Took me 2 full years. I did all the illustrations myself. And then years went by and I kept selling this book, and people kept saying, oh, I love that book. That's my Bible. And it was printed with a blue cover. So they'd say, do you still have that blue book? And I'd go, when I had boxes and boxes of the book at home because I had it printed. I had 2,000 copies printed, and I sold 1,000 in New Zealand, and it's quite a small country. And then years later, I sent a copy to Aldous Ozalands, who's well known in interpreting settings.
He was one of the academics who penned the Aussie Code of Ethics, for those of you that don't know.
That's right. And he's very good. He's an excellent presenter. He manages to be both serious and funny and entertaining at the same time. But anyway, I sent that book to Aldous with another book, and he said, gosh, that book you sent me, no, I don't like that at all. But that blue book, whoa! He said, why did Sandra Hale and I never know about that? Why didn't we know about that in Australia? And him saying that gave me the confidence to think, wow, I need to update it, I need to internationalize it, and I need to send it to a really good publishing company. And I thought, where shall I start? I thought I'll start with John Benjamin's, because I think they're really, really good. So I sent it to John Benjamin's, and I got an email back from Isha Conan, the editor, the same day, and she said, thank you for offering to publish with us. I actually sent her a PDF of the book. It was called A Brief Guide to Healthcare Settings and Healthcare Terminology, and she wrote, thank you for offering to publish. And I thought, what? Unbelievable. And then it took me another year to internationalize the book. And the illustrations were done by an AUT graphics design student, and they're very, very good.
I'm looking at the book right now, and I am one of those people who call it their Bible. I was introduced to the book in 2015 at RMIT University, and ever since it's my go-to book for whenever I have to do healthcare interpreting. And I was full-time healthcare interpreter for a hospital. I was working as an in-house interpreter, and this book, oh my God, it just saved my life on so many occasions. It doesn't even, when you say it goes into the anatomy and goes into disorders and common treatments, yes, it does that, but it goes beyond that as well. It talks about systems, hospitals, how hospitals work, how do medical staff work, what kind of ethics are involved, how does the emergency department work, understanding the duty of the interpreter, how does medical terminology work. It goes far and beyond just having a look at body systems and terminology. It's the full kit, if you could say, not just healthcare interpreting, but just interpreting as well. Which brings me to, so this obviously is available for university students, but it's also available for interpreters as well. So those that have even got their training and completed their masters in interpreting, their advanced diploma, undergrad, anything that may be, they could still very much benefit from this book, in my opinion.
So Fatih and I are working on with Oktay Esa, who is an associate professor of interpreting and translation in Turkey. We're working on a version specially aimed at Turkish-speaking translators and interpreters, and it's coming along really, really well.
Yeah, so let me talk to you about some of the other languages it was adapted into. Let's talk about what an adaptation is. So let me just quickly go through the languages. We said that it was adapted into Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Arabic. A Russian iteration we know is on the way, and you and I and Associate Professor Oktay is working on a Turkish iteration. What happens in these adaptations? They're not full translations of the book, are they?
No, they're not. Except the Korean version, which I've got here at home, and which you can really only buy. I think you can buy it online, but you need to know Korean. And I bought my copies at the Monster Bookstore in Seoul. That's been published by the Hankook University of Foreign Studies. And so it's available in their bookshop as well. But that's a translation, and the others are not translations. So the Spanish adaptation, there's a lot of Spanish. There's a big need for Spanish-speaking interpreters in the United States. So we decided to make sure that the health system described there was the United States healthcare system. So that means that the registered nurses, doctors, they all have a different scope. Training is different. So we talked about training, and also about the Affordable Care Act. I think before it came in, because that one was published in 2015. Talking a little bit about the culture of Spanish-speaking countries, and there's so many different ones. It's almost impossible. It's not one single country.
It's like Arabic, isn't it? I mean, it's spoken in 20 countries.
Yeah, so many different regional variants of the language as well. And we added glossaries, bilingual glossaries, English to Spanish, to many of the chapters. So all the main keywords in those chapters have then been translated into Spanish, and that was done during using the Real Academia Madrid Spanish, which is the very perfect Spanish. But then it was proofread and edited by someone in the United States, and they brought some Mexican usage into it as well, and plus some things like esnifar, which is a Spanish word for sniff. It's not used in Spain, but it's used in the United States.
So like a Spanglish version?
Yeah, it's like a Spanglish word, but they wouldn't want to call it that. And some things like ergoterapeuta, which means occupational therapist. In the United States, it's called terapista ocupacional. Again, somebody in Spain would go, what on earth? But so it's all these different regional variants. And so that's what we've done with all the version, except I think with the Korean one, which is basically the first part of the book was, a big part of it has just been translated into Korean, and that's been a massive job, of course.
That would have been a huge project.
Yeah. So every time we do a new iteration, we also make sure we update it so that all the online versions since last year have got the entry COVID-19 and coronavirus, and of course kept that very general because we just don't know the last thing about this virus yet, and with all the different variants coming up.
So I'm pretty sure that there'll be a new update of that coming in the upcoming years.
Yeah, that's right. So we have to, of course, they can't keep printing the books with the new changes, but the online version, because all those books are available as ebooks, so they all have the COVID description and the glossary translations.
My first version was an ebook I accessed through RMIT University Library. So how do we get our hands on this book if we're not in a university, or where do we purchase the book?
I think some people go to Book Depository. It depends, with the pandemic, there's differences in times or how quickly you can get it. So if you want, some people really love having a hard copy so that they can highlight and scribble things in the book. In that case, they either go for Book Depository or for Amazon, or they order it direct from John Benjamin's. John Benjamin's will always add postage, and they usually courier things, so you still get them very quickly, even in the current situation from John Benjamin's, but they will add that onto it. And then of course there's the ebook versions available through university libraries, and if you want an ebook version, you'll have that as soon as you've paid, and that should not be more expensive. That should be the same cost as the paperback versions. If that's not the case, then just write to bookorder@johnbenjamins.com, I think it is, at Benjamin, bookorder@benjamins.com, and they will help you. And I ordered them for my students. They're very lucky because I get an author discount, and so I ordered them for my student with an author discount, and my student pay exactly what I pay, including the postage. So I usually order about 10 or 20 so they can share the postage.
Very lucky.
So it doesn't cost too much.
I've my students, when they purchase it takes them like a week or two sometimes, but that was pre-COVID, so it might take quicker, it might take longer, I'm not sure, but it is definitely something that should be in not just students of the translation interpreting profession, but also practitioners as well, because I think it's just something that you'll keep using for the rest of your professional career. It's just a great resource. So on behalf of all the interpreters and translators out there, I just want to say thank you so much for introducing this Bible into our lives.
You're very welcome. I'm glad I put in all those years and all those hours.
It's not even the 2 years that you actually spent writing, isn't it? It's your career as a nurse, a registered nurse, and then as an interpreter, translator, and then an educator as well. So years of experience going into this book. So please, if you're interested in healthcare interpreting and translations, make sure you get your hands on this. You will not regret it. So any words of advice for healthcare interpreters and translators out there, as an educator and as a practitioner and as an author, any words of advice?
I think there's a lot of different ethical dilemmas. I think so one of my words of advice would be around that, and the other one would be about try not to book yourself. If you have any say in booking yourself and you're going to go to a setting where it's not sure how long the setting is going to take, don't book yourself in straight after, because your session may run over time and then you can't make it in time for the next session. So that still happens a lot, and people still talk to me about that a lot. Another one is the fact that we tend to come from either very individualistic societies like New Zealand, like the Netherlands, like the United States and Great Britain, or we come from more traditional societies where the family and the group are more important than the individual. And then it's not unheard of for family members who have an ailing, usually older relative, but it doesn't matter what age that relative is, who will wait for the interpreter in the corridor outside of the room and say, please, if the doctor mentions anything about cancer, can you just leave that out? That's a recurrent issue for...
It happens quite often.
Yeah. I would say, I don't know what you do, but I usually say to my students, you have to interpret whatever is said. That's not your choice. But if they feel very strongly about that, then all you can do is say, look, I'm the interpreter. My role is to interpret everything. That's also my code of ethics, which I have to abide by, my professional code. But if you feel very strongly about that, we can wait for the doctor, and before he goes in, you can convey your feelings to the doctor, and I will interpret between you and the doctor.
That's
And
great.
then you hand it over to where it should be, which is with the doctor or the health professional.
Well, what are your thoughts on an interpreter who knows so much about healthcare, who might even have a healthcare professional background as yourself? It's there's a fine line between knowing so much and being an interpreter that having all this information, you might start giving advice or giving guidance. What do you recommend when something like this would potentially happen?
Yeah, you can't give guidance at all. I remember I think most difficult situation I was in was one day I was called and asked to go and do a Spanish interpreting job, and I said, no, I'm actually not a Spanish speaking interpreter, so I can't do that. And so they said, oh, but we've rung everybody and they're all on holiday, so can you do it? So I went, and it turned out to be a refugee lady, Spanish speaking lady. She just had a child, and she delivered a baby, and there was talk about catgut stitches which needed to be removed. Oh my goodness. So anyway, so the interpreting, I had really refused to go, but they said, there's nobody else, can you please go? Anyway, everything went relatively well. I did my best. I think I conveyed everything, even the stitches and everything else about the next checkup. But then outside of the room, once we'd left the room, the lady followed me and she said, I'm actually not 40, I'm 45. But I didn't want to say that because they might not, I was afraid they would turn down my refugee or my asylum seeker application. And I said, look, we can go back to the doctor and you can tell her that. But what if the doctor goes to the immigration service? I said, doctors have take an oath of confidentiality. But we can go back to the doctor if you want to, and you can tell her that, and I'll interpret for you. And so then I went home and I thought, did I say too much now by saying that doctors have an oath of confidentiality? And saying that, we can go back to the doctor and you can tell her that, and I'll interpret for you. Because I was already training interpreters, so I thought, well, I don't know if I've overstepped the margin here. It's a very difficult one because, of course, unlike conference interpreters, we are right there on the spot. We are Johnny on the spot, and they will follow us into the car park and ask us things. And I know a sign language interpreter trainer, Doug Bowen-Bailey, and he says that very often deaf patients in the States will say to him, Doug, can you, what did the doctor say? And then he will say, the doctor said you take this medication 2 in the morning, 2 at night. And he said to me, I'm not adding anything. I'm not giving advice. I'm just repeating. I'm just being an interpreter. I'm repeating what they said. They asked me to repeat, and I'm repeating. I'm not giving them advice. And I thought, wow, that's another way of looking at it again. And so it's what I said earlier. I just keep learning, and I'm very flexible. I'm not a rigid person. So whenever someone comes up with their opinion or their perspective, I give it some thought. And I usually think that, there is something in that as well.
Yeah, I think we can always learn a lot from other practitioners. And there's, no matter how much we think we know something, little do we know that there's so much more to learn, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's why I like Aldous' presentations on ethics, or what he calls the terror in the waiting room. It's quite funny. Exactly.
And in regards to demand and control schema, I think we'll talk about this in the future again.
Yes, with Robin Dean. You said that you'd been in touch with Robin Dean, so that is fantastic.
I hope to have her on one of our podcasts and talk about the demand control schema, which it was one of the most important learnings I received in my education, like your Introduction to Healthcare and Interpreting book, was learning about the demand control schema and how helpful it can be in ethical dilemma situations.
Very helpful.
Thank you so much for joining me today. You have been amazing. It was such a great pleasure talking to you, and amazing to have you in our first episode for season 2 in the year 2021. And good luck with the Russian iteration of the book. And also good luck and all the best with the Turkish iteration of the book. And we hope to see you again in the not so distant future.
My pleasure. Very welcome. Thank you, Fatih, for being such a good interviewer.
Thank you. It's just so easy talking to you, Ineke, as always.
Thank you. Bye.
And thank you, everyone out there, for tuning in and listening. Don't forget to have a look at our website, conversationsinterpretingtranslating.com.au, for training opportunities for online courses as well as webinars. And follow our YouTube channel to have a look at all the podcasts and some of the webinars that we put on there. And also you can download the podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify. Please be sure to subscribe, download and like. And we will see you in next week's episode, which is going to be our Ask Nati episode. So looking forward to getting your questions on that one as well. There is a question form out there. I'll also put it up on our YouTube channel as well. You can find it on our website as well as the Nati website, where you can click on the form and actually ask a question directly to Nati, and we will direct your questions to a panel of managers from Nati. Okay, and thank you so much again, Professor Ineke Kreze, for today, and we see you in the next episode.
Thank you.
All Graduates Conversations Podcast.